Have you ever noticed that certain words in different languages sound sort of similar, like the word cemetery in English and cimetière in French? Furthermore, have you noticed that some words are written the same but sound completely different? Why is this? Some people say that languages are related, but how are they related? After all, most people know that Italian and Spanish are the direct descendants of Latin, but it is usually unclear what that means besides the fact that words sound similar in the sibling languages and words come from words in the parent language. But understanding the technical aspects of how one language becomes another or many others is important to historical linguistics and to understanding how human languages evolve as a whole. Firstly, it's important to conceptualize what's going on here before we get into any sort of specifics. When does a new language come into existence, or rather, what marks that transition? The answer is nothing. A language doesn't suddenly become another. Languages change bit by bit at a time until it is simply unintelligible with what it used to be. It doesn't work like organisms do, which produce offspring that have attributes of their parents, but which also exist in a state of always being cellularly separate and distinct from its parent. Instead, it's more like how species evolve as a whole, with attributes slowly changing over a long time, until eventually the thing that hatches out of one egg can't be considered to be the same species as its ancestor that hatched out of another egg oh so many millions of years ago. This can be difficult to imagine, so I'll give you an example. English. If you read something written in the 1800s, like A Christmas Carol, you'll notice that the way many people talk is minutely different. If you go back another 200 years or so to Shakespearean era writers, you'll find that their words, both in terms of diction, pronunciation, and structure, are extremely different from ours. For example, in 1628, John Donne wrote, "As well as if a manner of the friends o' thine own were, any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." It only gets more difficult as we go back about 100 years further to the writings of probably John Audeley, who wrote, "No mon this book he tak away, ne cutut no lef is se for hui." It's hardly even comprehensible, isn't it? Let's go back even further to the original text of Beowulf, which goes a little something like this.
Wat we gar dana, in jar dagum, feud kuninga, thrim ye frunon, hutha athalingus, ellen fremido.
Even though 11th century literature sounds like gibberish to us, it's probable that John Audeley would have been able to understand at least a little of it. And even though his writings are almost impossible to grasp, it's also probable that John Donne would have been able to understand Audeley's Christmas carols. But if all of this is true, why do we say that nobody speaks Latin anymore? Simply put, Latin really is a dead language. It really doesn't exist anymore. All of its descendant languages are still considered to be separate languages because they are no longer mutually intelligible with one another. Someone who speaks Spanish can't understand Latin because of the amount of change that has occurred over time, in the same way that somebody who speaks modern English can't understand the language Beowulf was originally written in, even though it is the same original language that has only been estranged by slow evolution. So secondly, the question is what drives this process? Not why languages change, that's simply the result of so many different people trying to use a standardized system of communication, i.e. language, to convey all of the different thoughts, concepts, and relationships inside their heads. No, the important thing to think about here is what is actually occurring over time. There are two major reasons to focus on: sound changes, and then non-phonological changes that can make new words, dispose of obsolete ones, and contort existing ones beyond recognition. Let's look at sound changes first, as they're the simpler of the two. When sound change occurs, it begins with the same sort of changes that allow us to distinguish different dialects of a language. For example, everyone in a region of English speakers begins to pronounce the ing ending of a word as in. In this situation, the ng sound has become an n sound. Certain dialects do this and some of them don't. But let's imagine that in the next few hundred years, every English speaker regularly pronounces words ending in ing as if they end in. Then we would say that the present participle and gerund of a verb are usually formed by adding the suffix in, as opposed to saying that it's formed by adding the suffix ing. Sometimes things are more complex though. Let's look at the Proto-Indo-European language, which is a theoretical ancestor of all Indo-European languages. That means everything from Irish to Persian, Norwegian to Punjabi, and Spanish to Serbian. If you look at the Proto-Indo-European language, its sounds, its words, it may seem rather absurd. How could this be the ancient ancestor of Latin or Greek or Sanskrit? The answer is a series of specific sound changes that have occurred in the history of this language family. We'll look at three just to get a sense of them: Grimm's Law, Bartholomew's Law, and the changes that produced Centum versus Satum languages. So Grimm's Law. Grimm's Law is a three-part chain shift. According to this chain, in the process of becoming the Proto-Germanic language, which would eventually become English, the aspirated voiced plosives of Proto-Indo-European first became unaspirated voiced plosives, then unaspirated unvoiced plosives, and then unaspirated unvoiced fricatives. This means that duh becomes ta, becomes th. An example of this is the word brechter, which becomes brother, which becomes brother, which becomes broder. This eventually gives us the English brother and the German bruder. Hopefully you'll notice that the first consonant didn't go through the entire chain, as it never became p or f. However, it definitely shows part of the expected progression. You can find this in a lot of other words where things that begin in p in Spanish or Italian become f in English. How about fish, foot, and father? Next comes Bartholomew's Law. This law applies to the Indian and Iranian subgroups. The best example is the Proto-Indo-European word veld, which in the participial form becomes belto. According to a different law, the b becomes a b because it is followed by an aspirated consonant. Bartholomew's Law says that those last two consonants next to each other produce a d. Have you figured out what word it becomes yet? After a few vowel shifts, beldo evolves into Buddha. Another example is the Proto-Indo-European change of helgto to the Old Avestan augda, because that aspirated voiced consonant is followed by an unaspirated voiceless consonant. Our last sound change to skip across is actually a collection of sound changes, but we're going to look at the results of them. Different changes caused a divergence in the eastern and western halves of the Indo-European language. In the Celtic, Germanic, Italic, Tocharian, and Greek subfamilies, the velars and the palato-velars merged into a single velar set, while the labio-velars remained a distinct series of sounds. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and India, the labiovelars and plain velars merged into a velar set, while the palatovelars remained separated, but underwent a process called sibilation, which means that those sounds were changed into a sibilant sound. In this case, those sounds probably became something like an S or a sh. There are dozens of sound changes that have occurred all around the world in the past 40,000 years, and you can really get lost in them if you want, but now I'm going to turn to the second agent of change in a language. You'll notice that some words in Spanish sound nothing like their counterparts in English, and there's a reason for this too. One of the best examples is the Spanish word molestar. It's spelled like the English word molest, and it even sounds a lot like it, but molestar translates strictly to bother or annoy, without the modern English connotation of sexual molestation. In the two languages, the words stayed the same, but the meanings broke away. You can see this in modern dialects of our own language if you look around enough. For example, in the New York area, the word punk has, well, an anal connotation, while in most other places it doesn't. Another way that words in different languages may end up being etymologically different is because the people may begin to define the same concept with words that are based off of different words in the original language. For example, the English word clown comes from a Germanic word for peasant, while the Spanish word for clown, payaso, comes from the Italian word pagliaccio, a type of theater character that wore straw clothing, which itself comes from paga, meaning straw. Sometimes the changing meanings of a word result in there being multiple words for the same thing, so one of them drops out of use, having become obsolete. If that word was derived from the same source as a non-obsolete word in a different language, then the other remaining can be completely dissimilar. For example, the English word deliciate dropped out of use because it essentially has the same meaning as to enjoy. Deliciate and the French délecter are related, but enjoy and délecter are not. It's not always so clear-cut either. Sometimes only meanings of a word are dropped out of use. The word absolve used to mean not only what it currently means, but also to finish, to accomplish, and abrupt used to mean broken away. Sometimes the cognate in another language may still have that obsolete meaning, even though the equivalent word in our language does not. Lastly, there are word borrowings, which are obviously going to result in new words that don't respect the same sound changes that brought forth the other words in the language from its parent. For example, say somebody who speaks English invents something and decides to call it a blog. Rather than have every language come up with a word based off of that language's words for web and log, everybody in the world just uses the word blog, or at least the closest thing that fits into the sounds of their language. An interesting class of this type of word is words that are re-borrowed. For example, the word telephone is built out of Greek roots that are just copied and stuck together to form a new word. This is the first borrowing. Then the Greeks need a word for telephone, so they just borrow the word back, producing the re-borrowed word telefono. So hopefully this has opened your eyes to at least what sort of things are happening constantly in a language that cause it to slowly evolve until at some point in this gradual process that language is unrecognizable from its former state and we can name it a descendant language.